I don't remember that too much of
Oh, yeah,
Good morning. Before we begin class, Chris, would you start us off with a word of prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, we approach you at this time, so thankful that you have blessed us with this day, the opportunity to study your word. We're thankful for Mary and those who teach. We pray that you would be with them, with us as students, as we study your word, that we will be able to understand it, to apply to our lives, to live by the things you have us to do. We thank you for Jesus. We ask that you forgive us, and in his name we pray. Amen.
Let's open up our Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew 6, we're going to start off this morning by reading verses 16 through 18. Matthew 6, 16 through 18. And Charles, would you read those? Yes, Matthew 6, 16 through 18. Okay, as with doing charitable deeds and prayer, which you've already stated about, we have the same thing applied here to fasting. And we discussed fasting on Wednesday already, and we talked about the Jews, they fasted for worship at times, Leviticus chapter 23, and there was other feasts they also fasted during. They fasted during times of persecution. They also fasted when mourning. And there's a few verses we're going to read about it, but we'll move on. But Chris covered quite a bit of this already. But let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 1. Second Samuel chapter 1, and we'll read verses 11 and 12. And Thad, would you read those? Second Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 and 12.
Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalek, and David arose to David, Ziklag. It came upon pass on the third day that a man came out of the camp, and Saul was full of strength, and hurt him on his face, and so it was. He came to David, and he fell on the earth, and he was off the pit.
Well, Thad, verses 11 and 12.
Then David took hold of his clothes and rent them, and likewise all men that were with him, and they mourned and wept and fasted until evening. For Saul had Jonathan, Jonathan's son, the people of the Lord, and the house of Israel, and they were followed by the sword.
They're just showing here that as they were mourning, you can see that here it says they mourned and wept and fasted until evening. This was after the death of Saul and Jonathan. And so they fasted during mourning. They also fasted to show humility. Let's turn over to Psalms. Psalms chapter 35. And we'll read just verse 13. Again, this is from David. Psalm chapter 35 and verse 13. And Jason, would you read that?
But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled my soul with fasting, and my prayer returned to my own bosom.
He's talking about those around him that had kind of turned against him, but he said when they were sick and they had problems, he fasted for them and mourned for them and was concerned about their health. But again, here, I humbled myself with fasting. So it was a show of humility also as they were fasting. They also prayed to God, fasted when they needed God's help. And we talked about on Wednesday, and we'll read a verse about that, but we know they fasted many times when they had sinned and wanted God to help them. But there was times that they just wanted God's help or wanted to know what God wanted, and they fasted during those times we read about also. Let's turn to Ezra. Ezra chapter 8. And we'll read verses 21 through 23. Ezra chapter 8, 21 through 23. And Michelle, would you read those?
And I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Abba, that we might humble ourselves before our God, to seek from him the right way for us and our little ones and all our possessions. For I was ashamed to request of the king an escort of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy on the road, because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all those for good who seek him, but his power and his wrath are against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and entreated our God for this, and he answered our prayer.
This was they're returning to Jerusalem, and again, they proclaim a fast here. They had already praised God in front of the king, and they didn't want to ask him for soldiers to accompany them to Jerusalem, so they fasted and prayed to God, again, showing humility, and when they needed God's help, again, they fasted and prayed to God. We read that also in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, and we'll read verses 1 through 4. Joanna, you want to read that?
It happened after this that the people of Moab, the people of Ammon, and others with them besides the Ammonites came to battle against Jehoshaphat. Then some came and told Jehoshaphat, saying, a great multitude is coming against you from beyond the sea in Syria, and they are in Hazazon Tamar, which is in Gedi. And Jehoshaphat feared and set himself to seek the Lord and proclaim a fast throughout all Judah. So Judah gathered together to ask help from the Lord, and from all the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord.
Here we have King Jehoshaphat, and he finds out that the Moabites and Ammonites are coming to battle, and there's even some across the sea, from Syria and other places, that are coming to battle against him. And of course, he proclaims a fast, and he wants God's help. What should we do? We got all these armies coming against us, and we're going to need help. So we see that they did proclaim fasts when they needed God's help, even when they didn't sin. But we know they did when they did. Quite often they had sinned, and they would ask for God's help and fast and pray. But even when they were right, they still turned to God and asked for their help, which they should, as we should too. And then let's read from 1 Samuel chapter 7. Start reading in verse 6. I'm sorry, 1 Samuel 7, verses 3 through 6. And Brian, would you read those?
Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, if you return to the Lord with all your heart, and put away the foreign gods of the Ashtoreth from among you, and prepare your hearts for the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. So the children of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtoreth, and served the Lord only. And Samuel said, gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered together at Mizpah, drew water, and poured it out before the Lord. And they fasted that day and said there, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the children of Israel at Mizpah.
Okay, again, they had sinned, and here they needed God's help and wanted him to forgive their sins and move on. And again, we see, and we've read that before, that they fasted when they had sorrow, godly sorrow over sin. And here we have another example of that. We have sinned. They fasted until we have sinned against the Lord, and they put away these strange gods. So there were several times in instances that they fasted in the Old Testament. The Jews did quite often, but the Jews weren't the only ones that fasted. Let's turn over to Jonah and read from Jonah, chapter 3. Jonah chapter 3, we'll just read verses 5 through 9. Jonah 3, verses 5 through 9. And Richard, would you read those?
So the people of Nineveh believed God and proclaimed a fast and put a sackcloth from the greatest of them to the least of them. For word came unto the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, and he laid his robe from them, and covered him with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he caused it to be proclaimed and published through Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, let neither man nor beast, bird or flock, taste anything, let them not eat nor drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth, and cry mightily unto God. Yea, let them turn every one from his evil way, and from the violence that is in their hands. Who can tell if God will turn and repent, and turn away from his fierce anger, that we perish not?
Okay, we know this story, the book of Jonah. He didn't want to go to Nineveh because he was afraid that maybe the city might do this and God would turn back. And we see here that they were warned, and the whole city here proclaimed a fast, the king and everyone. And it says here that neither man nor beast, herd or flock, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink water. So nothing. They just completely shut down, show God that they were sorry for what they had done. So it wasn't just the Jews that fasted and showed humility before God. Even Gentiles did. And we know in Acts chapter 10, in Cornelius, it says there in Acts 10, we won't take time to turn and read it for time up. But Acts 10 verse 30, it says Cornelius was fasting and in prayer to God when an angel appeared to him. So fasting was common back then. We don't do it as often in worship as they did back then, but something very common. So the teaching here back in Matthew 6 now, when they did fast, they weren't to be as the hypocrites, as Chris has brought out, actors or pretenders, to have an unhappy face or to have a made-up face here. So they appear to men to be fasting. They disfigure their faces. They put on a false face to hide their true face, so others would see them in that way. And it says here that they may appear to men to be fasting. That was the purpose of all this, wasn't it? Just like when Jesus brought up in the first part of the chapter about charitable deeds, and then later on he talked about prayer and here about fasting. Some of the Jews back then were doing things for the wrong reason, the wrong motivation. And here they wanted to do it to be seen of men. And it says here in verse 16 that they have their reward. If they did it for attention, they got what they wanted, but that's all. That's all they got was some attention. And we read the same thing in verse 2. Those that were doing the charitable deeds for attention, they had their reward. And in verse 5, the same thing. Those that were praying for attention, they had their reward. But that's not the reward we should want. We want a reward from God, not from other people just seeing us and getting it from attention. So in verse 17, we know that they did fast during worship services, and for worship, and they fasted for several different things. But Jesus says, don't do it for attention. Verse 17, but when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face. Clean yourself up. Quite often back then, especially when they were mourning, they would put sackcloth and ashes on themselves. And the way I take it, they didn't even clean themselves up. When they were mourning, and they did that, and that's what they did, was mourn for several days or whatever, how many days they wanted to do it. And so there was times they needed to clean themselves up. Verse 17, don't be like them and look like you're fasting. Don't do it for attention, but clean yourselves up. Carl, you had a point?
Yeah, it all goes back to attitude, the reason we're doing something. And here you see that he says that, as you just said, they had their reward because people observed them. But it says, we can fast to God, and nobody else around us even know it, but God is aware of it. And He will be pleased to reward us because of the way we do it, our attitude. It goes back to these people here are giving of their alms or their praying. It was all doing it to put on a show.
Right, we made the point in prayer that prayer is between myself and God. Fasting, if you're going to do that to God, then it should be between you and God. It's not, again, where it's charitable deeds or prayer or fasting. We need to do it for the right reason, the right motivation. And we've talked about that many times here. We won't take time there to turn back and read it, but on Wednesday we read from 2 Samuel chapter 12, when David's son became ill and he fasted and prayed to God so that the child wouldn't die. But when the child did die, what did he do? He got up, cleaned himself up, and went and ate. And again, that's kind of what it's saying here in verse 17. Don't appear to men and clean yourself up, look normal when you go somewhere, so that people don't know you're fasting. That's not the reason you should be fasting. You should be fasting between you and God, not to be seen by men. And that's what it says in verse 18. Clean yourself up, verse 18, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting. they shouldn't know. It's between you and God. If we choose to do that, then it shouldn't be for attention from men. Let's turn to Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6, we'll read verses 5 through 8. And Roger, would you read those?
Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh. Fear and trembling, sincerity of heart as to Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Goodwill doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free.
Okay. Here we have instruction to servants, or those of us that are employees. And here they weren't to do so with eye service. They were to do what their master or our employer tells us all the time, not when the boss is around. That's what it's talking about, eye service. Maybe they're sitting around talking, not doing what they're supposed to do. They see the boss walking, oh, we got to get busy. That's what they're talking about here. It shouldn't be that way. It's not just for when the boss can see us. We should be doing what we're supposed to be doing all the time. So these servants or employees, we should be working as we're told to do. It says here, doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill, doing service to the Lord and not to men. Again, it's for the God and not for men. We need to keep that in mind. But we should be doing the right thing all the time, not just for attention. And it should be to God. We read the same thing over in Colossians chapter 3. Verses 22 through 24. Colossians 3, 22 through 24. And Terry, would you read that?
Servants obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord you shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ.
Again, the same points made here, not to do it with eye service, but I wanted to read this as verse 23, we're to do it heartily as to the Lord again, and that was brought up in Ephesians, but also verse 24 here, that from the Lord you will receive the reward. We shouldn't be looking for attention from men. That shouldn't be the reward we're looking for. We should be looking for the reward from God. And that's what we're going to get into next here in Matthew 6, is a treasure and our reward that we can receive if we're doing the right thing. So again, motivation, we should be doing it for God and not for attention. Any more comments on motivation or fasting? Terry?
The part I just read in 24, knowing that of the Lord he shall receive the reward, that calls a little bit on our faith that we know what we're doing is God's going to reward us for it in his way, in his time. So that falls a little bit to our faith. That we have the faith that God is going to recognize what we're doing.
Right, being men, we could make promises or things can happen and we might not be able to fulfill it, but we know several places in the New Testament, God is faithful. What God tells us he's going to do, he's going to do it. We know that if we do the right thing, we will be rewarded. Stacy, you had a comment?
Are we to be fasting as a service to God today?
Well, that was something that they had as a commandment in the old law. I don't read that we have that anywhere in the New Testament. I don't see there's anything wrong with it. That if we choose to, personally, ourselves, to do that, I don't see there's anything wrong with that. But that was part of the old law. It's something they did quite common back then. But I don't read anything in the New Testament that tells us we need to. Any other comments on that?
We do fast today, not for spiritual reasons, but physical. Like people have to fast before they go to their doctor, and they have to fast before they give blood, that kind of thing. I agree with you. I don't think it says anywhere in here that we have to do it for spiritual reasons. Sometimes I do think there's religions though that do it. I used to have a friend that I think it was called Ash Wednesday. She put a dot of ash on her forehead. And she told me that she fasted and did that kind of thing. But I don't think it's commanded of us.
Well, as you brought up, one more morning, do we not many times fast? Not necessarily fasting to the Lord, but we don't feel like eating, do we? You just don't feel like it. Or there's other things that happens in our life that we don't feel like eating. We fast still, but not necessarily to the Lord, but we do fast. Brian, you had a comment?
I mean, we're told pretty clearly here that just like praying and giving to the needy, that there is a reward that comes from God. So I know mostly in modern day America, it's very rare to fast as any kind of, again, all these examples when we're mourning, we have an important decision to make, and all kinds of things like that. We do have examples of people doing that even in the New Testament. But the language and the reward is the same as the ones we've been reading in the past weeks of class. So if we don't fast, I guess my question is, what reward are we missing out on? But what is that reward? Like, I'm truly curious, like what is the reward for fasting that comes from God? We're told there is one. And so if we're not doing it, what reward are we missing?
Well, we were just reading about Jesus in Matthew 6. The old law is still in effect at that point, right? So they would be fasting for God. If we fast, if we do choose to fast, which I think that's a personal decision. I can't read in the New Testament we're told to do that. But if we choose to fast to God, then that's something we're doing towards Him. Anything we do towards Him, whether it's prayer or charitable deeds or showing up for service or singing, if we don't do it the way we should be, then we're not going to get the reward that we want. So I would assume that's the same with fasting. If we don't fast the way we should, we're not going to get the reward. Anything we do with God, we got to do it for the right reason, the right motivation, or we're not going to receive that reward. Carl, you had a comment?
The reward we're not going to get home there. If we don't live as God wants us to, we're going to miss out on that reward, the ultimate reward.
Well, yeah, if we have commandments and things that we have to do, and we know if we don't follow those, we're going to not receive that reward. But I don't see that we're commanded to fast in the New Testament. So, but if we choose to do so, we still should do it for the right reason, and that's between us and God. If we don't do it the right way, then we won't get the reward we wanted. Is there any more comments? Somebody else had a Butch?
Yeah, in 1 Timothy 4, the first 4 verses, this may have some application here. It's worth thinking about. And it says here, 1 Timothy 4, verse 1, now the Spirit speaks expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, commanding to abstain from foods which God has created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. For every creature of God is good and nothing to be refused if it be received with thanksgiving. Now we look at that expression here, commanding to abstain from foods or meats, King James says. We often apply that to the restriction, like, someone telling you not to eat pork, like was under the old law and all that. But at the same time, the application, if someone comes up and says, well, we require this fast, you can't eat this certain day. Where are they getting that command at? There's no authority for it. They begin to find things like that where there's no authority, because you can't go and find a place. If we were instructed, required to fast, we'd have instruction on when to do it, how long, whatever, specifically. But we're told that when we do it, it's like marriage. You're not required to be married, but if you are married, here's how to act. Kind of like that. What do you think about it?
Chris, you had a comment?
Well, that's right. There is no direct commandment that says so. But there is a lot of benefit that can come from that. That's what we're seeing in this. We are told that we're to meditate, we're to think on these things, we're fix anything. And fasting is a way to facilitate that. It's a way for us to just take some time and to really think about and meditate and dwell upon, pray to God, and just really concentrate our attention on the spiritual things. That's really what the purpose of fasting has always been, was whatever the circumstance was, it was a way for them to stop, take some time, and really focus and think about and meditate on something. And so it may not necessarily be a command, but there's a lot of benefits spiritually that can come.
Right, true. Brittany, you got a comment?
Yeah, I was just wondering what you thought in the passage is meant by reward.
What I thought about reward?
Yeah, what is in Matthew 6 in the passage, like Brian brought up, what is the reward that's being referred to? Probably
Was, yeah, the follower who sees in secret will reward you openly. Well, we know we have a reward in the end, in heaven. There's other rewards we get in this life. Can I say which reward it may be talking about, whether it's rewards we get here physically or rewards we get in heaven? I can't say either way, but we get both. If we're not following God as we should, there's rewards both physically and spiritually that we won't get. And as far as which reward it's talking about here, I can't say for sure because it doesn't tell us. But we know they were looking for a reward, instant gratification. They wanted men to see them. If we do things the right way, God's going to know and we'll get a reward. We know we have more than just one kind of reward. Michelle, you had a comment?
Well, I have two, but in reference to the reward too, a lot of times in the Old Testament times, God would reward people in the sense that He would bless them either with riches or with good health or whatever, and those things were both good blessings. It doesn't work that way in the New Testament necessarily, but in the Old Testament, people were rewarded like that. When they were faithful to Him, He would bless them with certain things if they were good. But then also back on the abstaining from food, when Terry was bringing up the ashes on the forehead, I know a lot of Catholics will do that for Lent around Easter time. And I actually looked it up one time and I'm trying to reference Leviticus. And so it's like an Old Testament law that they're still trying to follow. It's not in the New Testament, but they're still trying to follow the Old Testament by giving things up and abstaining themselves for things for God.
Yeah, and we know there's quite a few people try to pull things from the Old Testament still to worship God, and they shouldn't. They should learn and turn to the New Testament, but that happens quite often. Carl, you had a comment?
Be able to get up in the morning, be able to be here today. Those are rewards that we don't realize it, but these are rewards that God gives us.
We have physical and spiritual blessings right now. We haven't got to heaven yet, but we still have those blessings now. Yes, Katie?
In this chapter earlier, it was talking about praying. He uses the same phrase when you pray and see where your Father sees it and rewards you openly. It's talking about the same reward in both places. You're going to be rewarded for doing what God says.
Right. In the end, we're going to get a reward. And we know that. That's been promised to us. And we know that God's going to keep His promises. Right. Wow.
You are not rewarded with more time.
Yeah, just another thing we might look at is 1 Timothy 4, verse 8. It's talking about exercise. It's good to exercise. No one would argue against that. You would not tell anyone not to exercise. But you're sinning if you don't.
Right.
The thing is, it says bodily exercise profits a little. It does. There's benefit from it. There's reward in it. But it's godliness that profits in this life and in the world to come. That's what God requires, is godliness. You're not told anywhere you have to exercise. And if you were, then you'd have some instruction regarding it. But if you do, conduct yourself as you should. Just like if you're married, then certain things apply to you, etc.
Right. Our conduct should always be to the glory of God. We talked about that recently, no matter what we're doing. Go ahead, Brian.
I've thought about that before too. I mean, this is just like, these are just things that I'm considering, like in that passage. Is fasting fasting closer to bodily exercise, or is it closer to godliness? Like, is there anything godly about fasting? I mean, it seems to be done in circumstances where we are needing or wanting something from God, or when we're considering godly things. But is it something like physical exercise where, or like one question I ask myself when reading through passages sometimes is like, if this passage wasn't in the Bible, like if it wasn't here, would it change anything about how I live? You know, and if not, then why is it even here? Like, why do we spend time reading it and studying it? It's just a question. Like, I'm not necessarily looking to you for an exact answer to that, right? But it's like something to think about when we're reading these things, and not to make some kind of law out of it, but to truly appreciate its significance in this. Is it significant to us at all, or in America? Is it like, or now, you know, just us in our culture today, right? We reference multiple times that in old cultures this is very common. Does it have no meaning for us today? That's significant, right? Not that we can't, not that we have to do it or don't have to do it, but like, what is its significance? I mean, those are ideas that I think we've been talking about, kind of talking around. But I guess, but to that passage, like, is it something that's merely like exercise, or is it in some way God? Well, there's a reward attached to it, like a reward from God, which we never told exercise has a reward from God. That's what makes me think this might be closer to godliness than exercise.
Well, and Chris brought up the reason you would do it is to concentrate on God and praying to God and your relationship with God. So you're thinking about your relationship to God as we should be. But
yeah, it seems to have to do with focus and giving your full attention to things. That's in all the passages where it's used. But also, look at Acts 23, verses 12 and 13. Here's some people that were fasting so they could give their full concentration, but it's not for the right thing. They made a curse. They wouldn't eat or drink till they killed Paul.
Right.
They were fasting and everything, but it's not for the right reason. Everything. So again, if we come back to why a person does it, and then if you do, like in the case of mourning, or if you need it for your concentration, or whatever it is, or if you do it for health reasons, whatever the reason, then here's how to do it. Here's how to do it. Don't do it like they do it like this.
Yeah, between you and God. Well, when I'm studying for class, I don't eat. I'm concentrating on studying. So I fast for a little while then. I don't know about you. Chris, maybe he does it. When I'm concentrating on studying for class here, that's all I do is concentrate on studying for class. So in some ways we could apply that to ourselves still. There's still things we do that in our speaking, we do fast. Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, like in still in Matthew 6 and verse 16, because they were doing it for benefit of men and benefit of themselves, not for God. In 16, then they say that if you fast to God, just like Rick brought up prayer, and you get your mind right. But in verse 16, they were doing it for physical reasons only with men. And of course, that was going to be their, as he says, they have their reward, what they get from men, even though they're taking it. You know,
Right.
you don't get, they didn't even get any reward there. But if we were commanded to it, yeah, but we're not.
Yeah, and it doesn't. However our conduct is as a Christian should always be to the glory of God, no matter what we do. If we change the past or don't, we still should be doing it the right way. Thank you.
Let's go do it all at once.
I was all ready to get talking about treasure. Come close to getting there.
Well, I tell you, those questions just keep on coming back. You know, I did it all the time. I'll have my whole outline, and I'll barely get past the introduction. People may comment on the ask me, which is good. Yes. We want the interaction. But I'm thinking, there's a whole outline that we need to get to.
I was surprised there would be that many more comments.
Well, that's the big